am Kathleen. I am also with the Bridge Club and working with Catherine tonight. And I had some questions for Dr. Jodi. So I wanted to take a chance to maybe jump into a different line of questioning. But, Catherine kind of mentioned, and we talked about in our discussions, nutrition is a really emotionally charged conversation and decision. And it's emotional for the pet parents, but it can also be emotional because there's conversations that come up that we don't know about. So how do we handle the more delicate conversations around therapeutic diets or managing a disease process?
Right. It is interesting because a lot of the conversations that you have, for some reason, nutrition is a very powerful subject to discuss with owners. And I think that's because it's one area of their pet's health that they feel like they have control over. I mean, they control what they feed their pet, they control how much they feed their pet, and they're also often really proud of what they're doing for their pet. So they'll come in and they'll say, "Oh, I'm feeding this diet," and that is probably not the diet you would recommend, but they're so proud of feeding this because everybody again comes into that room with the idea of taking care of that pet in the best way possible. So I think that number one, when we approach these emotional conversations, remember that it's a partnership. The reason that you're there is because you care a lot about their pet and also about them. And I also think that there's ways to reframe the conversation. So, for example, if we're talking about obesity, I think one of the most difficult conversations to have with clients, I always try to approach the conversation as an optimist. And we know that if the pet is an ideal weight, they tend to live plus or minus 2 years longer than an animal who is obese. So what if we approach that topic with that owner by saying, I think I can help you help your pet to live a longer, happier life. I want to help. Let's figure out a way to talk about that and figure out how we can do that. I think reframing it as an optimistic, positive conversation rather than going in there and saying, listen, your pet is way too heavy and we got to figure out how we do this or your pet's going to die early. Nobody wants to hear that. And we tend to want to impress upon people how dangerous obesity is. But I think that we can actually approach it in a way where we are looking to, this is how we're going to make your pet's life better. And it's also, we can make your life better because who doesn't want their pet to live longer and be happier? And what we should remember is that nobody makes their pet obese because they don't love them. They love them too much. Food is nurturing, and that's how they express their affection. So remember that, again, I think this is true with any conversation. Assume the best. They've gotten to this position because they just love their animals so much. So how do we channel that love into a direction that's actually more beneficial for the pet? And we have ways to do that with diet. So I think that we can approach it from that angle. And I think that, so there's that conversation where you're trying to address obesity, but there's also conversations about what if they're feeding a diet that maybe wouldn't be your first choice. And again, I think we ask them, I think first of all, we need to figure out where they came to that decision. And so a lot of people are emotional, and we should figure out why. So are they emotional because they distrust large pet food companies or big pharma? So that's a discussion we can have. Are they emotional because they don't know what position you're coming from? They don't know what our angle is. Are they emotional about it because they've gotten their information from other sources? They feel like they've done their research on the internet. They've heard from their sister that this is the best food. And I think if we start the conversation by doing some open-ended questions and figure out how they came to that conclusion, I think that also helps to take some of the emotion out of that by just having empathy and understanding where they came to this decision.
I think those are all great ways to start that conversation, and really approaching it from the positive perspective, like you said, and really just understanding. But what
Hmm.
happens when you kind of come up with that client, or you've had this conversation and they completely agreed with you, but then the next time they saw you, they couldn't wait to tell you about how they learned about feeding raw diets or home
Hmm.
cooked diets. And now they're confused because they have too much information. How does the nutrition conversation change when that happens?
Right. Again, I think that we have to be receptive to the information that they've had. So taking a
Mhm.
few minutes just to listen to what they've come with and what their source was. So if you recommended and this happens all the time. So I'll have veterinarians say, "Oh, I recommended your diet, and the owner took it home willingly, they trusted it, and then they got home and they read that ingredient panel, and now they're freaked out because they saw byproducts on the ingredient panel." And I say, okay, start from step one, which is saying, um, what concerns you? Tell me why you are concerned about that. Again, everyone wants to be heard, and I think that's the first step in this, is helping clients feel like they're being heard, because that helps develop that partnership as well. And then when we know what their objection is, let's address that. So for example, they say, I don't want to feed byproducts to my pet. I didn't like the fact that chicken byproducts was the first ingredient in there. Okay, what concerns you about byproducts? What worries you about that? To help hear them and then address that concern, rather than saying, well, this is a diet I recommended, and I think that you should feed this because this is what we recommended. Having And remember too, I think this is a mistake I made all the time. Communication is not conversation. So just because you have said it does not mean that you've had a conversation about it. I think that there has to be
That's a
a
good point.
two-way discussion to determine where their mind is at, where their heart is at, and figure out how we can meet in the middle. And also having the understanding that not everybody's going to do what you want all the time. Sometimes there's just going to be people who are at that time not open to change. That's okay. We can bookmark that and come to it later. Doesn't mean they're never going to be open for the conversation, but maybe they're just not ready today.
Just not ready for it at that point in time.
Right.
You said something interesting. You talked about ingredients,
Right.
but what about the importance of sharing ingredients and nutrients in pet food?
Yes, this is the main message. If you remember nothing else about nutrition, the main thing to remember is that pets need nutrients and not ingredients. Ingredients are simply the vehicle that delivers the nutrient that the animal needs. So, for example, animals need amino acids that they get from protein. They don't need protein per se, they need the amino acids that come from protein. So we really need to, again, I think that's just a matter of helping owners understand what that means. So let's go back to that byproduct conversation that we were having. Owners, I'll say, okay, what concerns you about byproducts? And typically what they'll say is, oh, it's junk, it's a filler, it's the stuff that's swept off the floor in the feed room. And I'll say, okay, well, it's actually not. It's typically organ meats. It's typically parts of the animal that are not utilized for human consumption. And it's a really good source of amino acids that um, provide the nutrient source that the animal needs. And when owners actually understand that, and they especially understand when you say things like organ meats, livers, there, I think that kind of imparts to them, oh, okay, I understand what this means, because this is a really great source of a nutrient that my pet needs. So that is a key portion of talking about nutrition, which is talking about that animals need nutrients and not ingredients, because the pet food market is totally backwards. Everything that you see in marketing on TV says no corn, no wheat, no soy. And when in reality, that's not looking at the ingredient panel is not a good way to figure out if it's a good pet food. You really need to know what nutrient profile the pet needs, and then figure out what ingredients deliver those nutrients. That's the key to really good pet foods. But it's totally backwards when you look at the marketing, because what a lot of companies will say is, okay, here are the ingredients that pet owners will or won't accept, and I'm going to adjust my diet around those ingredients. You really need to come to this with a pet first philosophy. Here's what the pet needs, here's the nutrients they need, and now let's figure out how we create a diet that delivers that in the best way possible.
Wow. So if you had to debunk those kinds of myths about every ingredient out there and convert that into nutrients, that is a lot of information. So we had a question come in from in the chat that says, as a veterinary student, where do you suggest that we start when we're looking to either formulate our own recommendations, or let's talk about how that information is getting out there in a reputable way to our clients?
Yes. Excellent question. It's a good question. So one of the best starting places is what's called WSAVA, WSAVA, which is the World Small Animal Veterinary Association. They actually have a nutrition toolkit on their site that helps guide you through so many of these questions. So getting a diet history, for example, they have a form on there that you can give to owners to help obtain a diet history. And then they also have questions that they recommend that you ask pet food companies to determine whether or not you want to recommend that pet food company. Things like, do you have a veterinary nutritionist on staff? Do you actually test the foods that you're selling? What is your philosophy? And what I would encourage everybody to do is, if you want to recommend a diet, really look into that company and figure out what are they doing that fits in with my philosophy. I want a diet that is actually tested on actual animals, that goes through feeding trials. There's actually, when you look at that, there's actually very few companies that really go through that rigorous process of making a high quality pet food. And I also encourage veterinary students and veterinarians, talk to your sales representatives, talk to people who come into your clinics, go to lunch and learns at your vet school for companies that come in, because that's a great source of information for not only diets, but also pharmaceuticals and other things that are offered to veterinarians.
So that's a great source of information, obviously, for us in the industry. How do we, what resources can we share with our pet owners that, because I know, so like I travel a lot, and when people find out I work with pets or in the pet industry, the first thing they want to know is, oh, what do you feed your dog? Right. So that, how do I communicate to our peers and our friends and our family members how to kind of go about debunking some of these myths on their own?
The best place to go for that is the Tufts Pet Foodology blog. So Tufts Cummings Veterinary School has an excellent owner-friendly blog that is written by their nutritionists, and you can actually search up topics that concern you. And that is one of the prime sites for high quality nutrition information. And also, I would recommend that they, reach out to their veterinarian that they know, that they trust. It's so interesting that we want information and we go online and trust these sources. And what I really recommend is talk to your veterinarian. We know that they actually have the ability to make this recommendation and recommend a food that, the most common question I'll get is, well, what do you feed your pet? Like, they really want to know what you're feeding.
How do we answer that? Because you mentioned earlier, like, we're proud of what we're feeding. We feel like we're doing the right thing, but how do we answer that question?
Yeah, so I typically recommend that they utilize one of the WSAVA recommended brands, which is Hills, Purina, Royal Canin, and Iams, because those are the companies that meet all of the criteria that are listed on their website. They're also brands that have some really sound science behind them, and also I think make really great contributions to the veterinary profession as a whole. And don't be afraid. I think we're so afraid to make those recommendations because we feel like, people will think that we're salespeople and we don't want to be perceived as that. But you wouldn't hesitate to recommend a brand of heartworm prevention that you think is the best. So don't be afraid to look at nutrition in the same way.
So, and I'm just checking real quick here to see if we have some additional questions. If you have any other questions, please feel free to join them to the chat and we will pass them forward. But I want to thank Dr. Jodi and thank Catherine for giving me an opportunity to ask some of these questions, because I love to talk about our pets and what we're feeding them, because I'm one of those food is love kind of people. So thank you for helping me understand how to talk about that in a better way.
But I want to get back to one thing that you had talked about earlier, if we can, because first of all, you made this amazing quote of communication is not a conversation.
Right.
So we know right now in practice, the amount of time that these students will be having with pet owners is getting reduced.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the reduction in time, but then you also made a comment earlier about the fact that the conversation can continue beyond the exam room. And so I am kind of curious, because I want to be very conscientious of the fact that people are overwhelmed when you are in practice. And as a student right now, you guys are completely overwhelmed. That how do we manage this notion of making sure that our communication turns into a conversation, and then how do you sustain it over time so that they actually are absorbing it? Sorry, that was very loaded.
No, it wasn't. It's a really good question. So there's a couple ways that you can do this. So a lot of people will have owners fill out a diet history form before they come to the clinic, because having that conversation when you have information beforehand is a lot easier than trying to do it on the fly. I think we all know that we like preparation time. So if an owner comes in and they have a diet history form filled out that takes minimal time, and you see that they're feeding a diet maybe you wouldn't recommend, or maybe they're feeding a raw diet, or whatever the case may be, that helps you prepare to have that conversation when you're in the exam room. I think preparation is key to having a conversation. And then it's follow-up, which means it can mean a couple things. Maybe the owner seems receptive to that conversation and you send home a handout, and maybe it has the information with the pet foodology blog on it. Maybe that means that you send a technician into the room after you've had that initial conversation to follow up with them and then say, okay, I know doctor talked to you about switching diets. Here's these brands that we recommend. And I also think a key is, if you have a receptive owner, a follow-up phone call from that technician in 2 to 3 days. Don't be afraid to utilize your technicians. They are so good at having these conversations when you don't have as much time. And a lot of practices now have a technician that is really devoted to nutrition and is really good at having those conversations. So don't be afraid to utilize your technician to have those conversations. They're actually really good at it. And I think, can you imagine? I was just going to say, can you imagine if your doctor followed up with a call, you'd be thrilled, So sorry, Catherine.
You'd be beyond thrilled. Usually you get that when something bad is happening, but I will say a lot of practices are getting better about saying, just making sure everything is okay, even after a wellness exam. And that's the perfect opportunity to bring it up.
Yeah.
We do have another question, so I do want to bring this one forward as well. And this one was, how can we gently discourage our pet owners from taking food recommendations from Facebook or from an employee at the store? How do we, or over the fence, hey, this is what we need. So how do we discourage that in a very gentle way?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. And I'm not sure I have a 100% answer, because I think that once we figure that out, we'll solve a lot of the world's problems, most likely. But I think that what we need to do is just make the recommendation. So if they come in and they say, oh, I did some research on Facebook and they recommended this diet, don't be afraid to have an open conversation with them and say, well, that may not be the diet I would recommend, and give them a rational reason why. Because I
Well,
think
it could
also
always be
finding,
based on breed. It could be based on the size of the pet, other underlying health issues. So I think that's always an easy way to say, that's a great food, but let me explain what might be
right,
better for Lily and what her current digestive issues are, or why we're really focused over here, because it's not the hair that's making her fluffy.
right,
It's
exactly,
her weight.
exactly. So I think that just being that trusted source for them, they trust you with everything else when it comes to their pet. I think if we open up and ask for permission to have that discussion and understand where they're coming from. So if they got the information from Facebook, who was it from? I mean, was it from your mother, or was it from a breed group? Those are two different conversations as well too. So I think understanding where the information came from and gauging how they feel about that is helpful.
Oh, I think that's really powerful, because that's the hardest part. I think that every member of the medical team faces. I heard
Hmm.
somewhere that I
Right,
should be doing this, and this is okay to feed as a treat, or this is okay to do for my food size. Can we
right.
talk about just quickly, and I know this is a basic one, but there is a lot of varying guidance in the profession right now about weighing the food or using measuring cups for the
Right,
food. And pet owners are confused because the packages don't indicate the weighing of the food. Most of them do
right.
not. So when a pet owner comes in and really wants to understand how much to feed their food, how can we give better guidance there? Because that seems to really be a cluster for a lot of people, because pet owners walk away and still end up,
Oh,
doing it wrong.
absolutely. Number one, figure out how much they're feeding and understand that a cup is not a cup to everybody. So a cup for some people is a true measuring cup, and some cup for some people is the big gulp Slurpee that they got from the 7-Eleven. So figuring out the amount that they think they're feeding is key. The second part is that in general, most measuring cups are inaccurate. They tend to be a little bit off, and owners tend to heap the cup. So if you say feed a cup, it's a big heaping cup. So we actually recommend, if you're serious about doing a weight loss diet for your dog or cat, we actually do recommend using a gram scale and weighing the food, because that
Okay.
is really the key way to getting that accurate measurement. And it's so interesting because I'll have a lot of cat owners who will say, my cat lost weight on a canned food versus a dry. And the reason is because a can is a can is a can. It's hard to, you can't mess up a measurement of one can. It is what it is. But you sure can make an error when you're feeding one cup of something, because maybe they're not using a true cup. Maybe the cup isn't accurate, or maybe they're heaping the cup. So measuring it with a gram scale, if you really want to have a serious weight loss conversation, is key.
Okay, so
So
we got two more.
Dr. Jodi,
Kathleen's got one, and then I've got one, and we'll head to
Sure.
our final two. But
okay.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm gonna squeak in maybe a two-parter here if we
Sure.
can. So you mentioned, weighing the food and using the right script,
Mhm.
but can you just talk to us a little bit about free feeding, making food available all day versus feeding once a day or twice a day,
when
and
that
then where
pet
do
owner brings it in and says, "We just leave it out
treats
all day."
fall into this? Because some people think like, oh, I'm not loving my dog enough if they don't have food on the floor all the
Right.
time. So help us talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think starting good feeding habits young is really key. And part of that is some dogs can do well, and some cats too can do well with free feeding, but most cannot. And I think we know that because upwards of 60% of our pets are overweight right now. So I think, again, and having that discussion right away when they have their first puppy or kitten visit, here's how we recommend feeding, this is why we recommend doing it, because also understanding why is key too, because otherwise you just look like a Grinch if you say, well, only feed this much twice a day of this diet. So I think explaining the reasoning why is a big part of that as well, to really helping owners understand why we're doing what we're doing. And also, one key part is adapting to the changes that the pet is going through. So after we spay and neuter our pets, especially cats, their energy requirements drop by 25% within 2 to 3 days. So they actually
Oh
need
wow.
25% less calories once we remove those hormones. And this is a great time to have that discussion. We send home discharge papers that say, hey, watch the incision, make sure they don't exercise. Why are we not putting down on there, listen, we've just done an alteration to hormones, you need to adjust diet accordingly. I think that's another conversation to have as well. Again, trying to be proactive and helping owners make the right choice.
Well, and back on the treat thing. So we'll stop with that. We'll end on the treats, because I do think when we think of nutrition as pet owners, I'm speaking as a pet owner coming into the exam room, I'm thinking about the bowl of food.
Right.
So I am not thinking, so when someone says to you, what are you feeding your pet? And I try to, I'm following the rules.
Right.
And I have not, and I have to be honest with you, I've not ever had someone ask me, except for Kara Burns on the Bridge Club,
right,
how many treats are you giving and how big are those treats? So that's not asked in the exam room. It's always focused on the main foods of nutrition. So how can this next generation of industry leaders, and that's who these students are, really be the ones to help change that dynamic, so you can rally in us pet parents and get us where we're supposed to be?
I think having owners fill out that diet history form is a big part of that. And then actually asking deeper questions, because again, this is a learn from my mistakes thing. I'd say, what are you feeding? And half the time they don't know. It's a green bag. My wife gets it at Walmart. And I would say, okay, and just not follow up. Don't be afraid to take an extra 2 minutes to really dig in on that. Okay, are you feeding treats? If so, how much, what type? We want to make sure they're no more than 10% of their daily intake every day. Also, things like, are they getting human food? And the things that people overlook are they getting bones? Are they getting rawhides? Are they getting dentist sticks? All of those things are tons of additional calories, which is why owners get frustrated with weight loss programs, because they'll say, oh, I cut back the food, or I was feeding this low calorie food and my pet didn't lose weight. Well, it's because they didn't adjust those other factors. Again, it's a taking the time to do it. And I think having owners fill out that form where it actually asks on there is really key to digging out some of that information that we really want to get.
And again, makes the job easier for the medical team, because they at least have the information in front of them. And again, your time is getting less and less in the exam room with pet parents. So it is critically important. So we are at the end of our time together, and I'm so sad about that. But for any of you who have any additional questions, please feel free to email us at the Bridge Club, Catherine@thebridgeclub.com. Happy to then pass those on to Dr. Jodi and see if we can help get those answered for you. We do try to have a nutrition conversation about pretty much almost twice a year on this. So please be sure you always are following what we're doing, because we try to bring really important conversations forward. But it's time for our end to, and see, look at Dr. Jodi even put it in there. I just wasn't going to give it up.
I popped my email into the chat box. Happy to answer any questions.
That's awesome. And then Kathleen, did you have the closing toast, or am I headed into the closing toast?
I do have the closing toast. And so
I love that.
I wanted to share that in my closing toast here, that an objection is really not a rejection, but it is simply a request for more information.
I love that. Cheers to that, everybody.
Cheers to that, and continuing the conversation.
That's right.
There you go. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.